As you would know from news reports, Yemen is occasionally makes the news for being one of the world's countries with the highest level of food insecurity. The World Food Programme maintains that nearly half the population doesn't have enough food. And in 2012, UNICEF declared that 500,000 children were at risk of death or severe physical or mental damage from lack of food. So I'm going to speak a bit, and this arises from work that I did with a Yemeni agronomist called Amin al-Hakimi, and with a French agronomist who's worked for 11 years in Yemen, Frédéric Pellat. I'm going to give a kind of broad overview of the food economy in the food production system in Yemen and its transformation. And then if I have any time, I will speak, but I think our general group often covers those kinds of topics. I will speak to the extravagant disconnect with the language that is still the dominant language for what should be done about food production and food security in Yemen of the international organizations that are particularly powerful in the case of Yemen. After major protests started, and I had the honor to be there at the beginning by an accident in February 2011, calls for food sovereignty or for the renewal of food production have scarcely been heard in the midst of the bullets and cries for basic rights. Yet in the protests, Yemeni youth marched holding aloft the image of President Ibrahim al-Hamdi, a leader assassinated in 1977, well before most of those who carried that image were born. And also from the South, the image of the President of the South of the same period. And he was assassinated, of course, in 77, the day before he was to go to Aden for a very different kind of Yemeni unity to that being contested today. What message do the images of al-Hamdi convey? The political message is clear. Former President Ali Abdullah Saleh and his backers have long been believed to have had a hand in al-Hamdi's elimination. But the economic symbolism, somebody as old as myself, was no less clear. Al-Hamdi was the last president from the north of Yemen who presumed that rural communities and towns of the country were to be places of production enhanced by collective action from below and by support from the state. In the north, since al-Hamdi's death in October 1977, and for the south of Yemen also following its unification with the north in 1990, there has been a political division of labor between decisions concerning development policy, and that's in a million quotes, for society at large, and those governing the building of the repressive core of the state, the military, security, and legal apparatuses. The first became the open and largely transparent responsibility of the major international US, European Union, Japanese, and Gulf aid institutions, and the second, the closed and unaccountable preserve of the Saudi-US Yemeni security military axis. Our concern here is with the first, but an understanding of Yemen's present crisis and of its contemporary political economic structure would require, and in fact requires, that the two sides of government be brought together in analysis. Every statistic concerning Yemeni government spending is falsified by the hidden sums of oil rent accorded the repressive and military machinery of the state. Only estimates exist. One study estimates that the cost of the central military is over 40% of the budget in 2011. Another estimate judges the budget for the military to be 4 times all expenditure on public services in the same year. Such estimates, of course, exclude direct political transfers, as from Saudi Arabia to particular political leaders, partial data for which for a few years back was published in 2012. But more generally, what does this structure tell us about the economy of Yemen? It reveals the centrality in Yemen's economy of political rent and oil rent, development aid here also understood as a form of political rent. Given the scales of the sums, for example, the Donors Conference in September 2012 in Saudi Arabia and then in New York at the UN pledged on paper nearly $8 billion in aid to Yemen for 2012-14. Of course, this is not necessarily delivered, but it is still a huge sum in relation to Yemen. And we need to be skeptical of orthodox economists' constructions of commodity markets and scarcity as guides to the best policies concerning food security in a place like Yemen. The determinative place of rent, that is oil rent and indirect political rent, is true not only for Yemen, of course, but for all the other Arab countries of the Mashriq. Throughout, ideological investment has more or less successfully, over the course of my own life, restructured fundamental understandings about work, reward, and family. The media culture of oil rent, with its omnipresent representation of the power of ready-made commodities manufactured elsewhere, dovetails with the investment in education and movements which valorize the roles of women as consumers and mothers and not as workers. If there is still little valorization of women's labor outside maternity, work more generally as a value in itself remains strikingly absent in state and cultural discourse. Workers figure positively as youth ready to travel elsewhere and to repatriate remittances to Yemen, or negatively as the mass of the poor and unemployed. This fact lies behind, these sets of facts lie behind the dramatic transformation of Yemen's forms of food production and food consumption over the last decades. And I want to briefly first characterize the transformation of the food production system before turning to the policies of international development agencies that in part guided such a transformation. So the erosion and transformation of the food production system. In the last 35 years, I first went to Yemen in 1971. There has been a wholesale transformation of the historical food production system of Yemen. At the core of these was a sorghum cattle household production nexus. And it was interesting that on an escort table that Rami put up, there was no sorghum for Yemen. It was just trait d'union, okay? It was, let's say there were no statistics. And so escort had nothing to report on. But the core of production in Yemen was a sorghum cattle household production nexus. Alongside that, according to rainfall or irrigation, households grew millet or maize in the lowlands and barley or wheat in the highlands. They also kept smaller animals, sheep, goat, chickens. But beyond grain crops, there were rain-fed legume and irrigated green fodder crops, smaller areas of irrigated vegetables and fruits, notably grapes and fruit trees in the highlands, and commercial crops such as sesame and cotton in the spate irrigated systems of the Tahama, and of course honey in the highlands. In much of the highlands, land ownership was something enjoyed by many households, landlord concentrations of ownership being central in the irrigated zones of the coastal plains and in the lands of lower Yemen, that is the area of Eb and around there, that enjoyed irrigation or higher rainfall. Now, what is the transformation that I'm alluding to? For rain-fed farming, substantial losses of land farmed were recorded relatively early. It is estimated that from 1975 to 1990, essentially about 49%, let's say half, of the original expansion of rain-fed cultivated land was lost. Half we're talking about. And when one looks at the statistics and the decline in the sorghum is so badly documented that it's hard to know what people are doing with sorghum grain. But barley and maize, for example, half as much as there was in the same period. So we have really dramatic losses in rain-fed farming. And these figures are comparable to those that are recorded in a land use survey in 2012, that of the land that is terraced, because Yemen is a mountainous country, today in 2012, the terraced rain-fed land represented about 45 to 50% of the area cultivated in the country. By comparison, in the 1970s, 85% of the land farmed had been rain-fed. So one's having big losses there too. So this first decline, this very major decline up until the early 1990s, was bound up with two basic factors. The first was a double subsidization of imported wheat, subsidized at the production end in the European and American productive systems, and at certain points in time subsidized, particularly from the early 1990s, but effectively subsidized even before that. The prices of imported wheat were subsidized inside Yemen as well. So it was a double subsidization of imported wheat. Second, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a mass migration following the oil boom of Yemen's rural male labor force to work in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And what this did was not only a question of removing certain important male labor from the land, but it removed labor from the political equation of North Yemen during the formative years of the construction of the military security state under President Ali Abdullah Saleh after 1978. Yemen's population then, of course, was much smaller in those years, and there was labor shortage. But equally important was the political withdrawal of labor as a factor at a point in time when, particularly under Ibrahim al-Hamdi, there was the potential of political backing for Yemen's labor and Yemen's production, but it, in a sense, just went off. Together with the seeming bounty of employment in the oil state's construction boom during the 70s and 80s, slowed only with the drop in the oil price in 1986, came the introduction of cultural models, television entering Yemen in the late 1970s, where women, and here I repeat myself, but it's an absolutely central point, where women were valued less for their work in agriculture and animal husbandry than for child rearing and domestic comfort. And that, together with some improvements in perinatal health care, led to a very positive increase in the population growth rate. Yet in 1991, Yemeni laborers were expelled in great numbers from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf following the wake of the first Gulf War. But far from this prompting a radical revision of political economic policy, Yemen had then in 1990 united with the South to the tune of its once president, the winner in the 1986 conflict in South Yemen, and who then became the vice president of the United Yemen, Ali Salem al-Beidh, promising, and I remember it so clearly on television, that on the strength of its own oil production, Yemen would soon be among the world's richest countries. And this from a former socialist, so to speak. So indeed, beginning in the late 80s, crude oil production came on, and it rose from about 200,000 barrels to 450,000 barrels in 2001, only to decline by 2011 back down to 200,000 barrels. But what does this matter? This cushion of oil rent allowed for a continuing growth of cities and of the military security employment that reached in 2011 something under 100,000 men in the regular army and over 100,000 in the regular army and over 70,000 in the various security forces. Now, Yemen is not distinguished among this, even among Arab countries by the quality of its statistical services, and hence it is difficult to quantify what the eye today sees. That is the formation of sharp economic class differences and the emergence of wealth on a scale simply unknown in Yemen of the 1970s. And relevant to the food economy are not only the prices on the world markets, but also the structure of internal marketing of basic food products. As we've seen, oil revenues from 2001 began to decline markedly after 2000 and leading after 2005 to increased inter-elite contestation. Since 2005, control over non-oil resources such as land, water, and agricultural produce has loomed larger. Unlike the differentiation that existed in the 70s and 1980s between a political leadership and the trading bourgeoisie, since the 1990s, the military security state has become the broker of access to urban property, contracts related to oil rent, aid rent flows, and the business of food importation. So linked to an international market dominated by only 4 great corporations today are a mere handful of important companies in Yemen. The top Yemeni company, which began its life as a military corporation but is a privatized affair today, is reported to control 56% of the market of food importation, and it is vertically integrated from importing through milling and distribution of wheat and other grains. Hence, the prices of basic food commodities in Yemen do not simply mirror shifts in world prices, but amplify them. A researcher for no less than the United Kingdom Foreign Office Research Unit wrote, "The importance of these elite commercial networks cannot be understated," and he wrote this in 2011. Less than 10 major groups from the tribe's military and business elite control over 80% of the country's import, manufacturing, and processes businesses, local commercial banks and hence credit, telecommunications firms, and most of Yemen's major transportation companies. Most importantly, they control the commercial networks that import and supply basic goods crucial to households, while in many cases also controlling the state apparatus required to implement economic reforms. But let's return to the agricultural sector of Yemen. As the core nexus of rain-fed subsistence agriculture was reduced, farmers in the highlands adopted two strategies. They expanded khat production. Khat is a mild amphetamine, it's a mild hallucinogenic qualities, which is the basis of, and whose consumption has massively expanded in Yemen over the years. And they sought also to invest in or have access to irrigation from lift pumps for higher market value crops. They were largely successful in a context where there was no government land registration and no regulation of the introduction of pumping equipment. But as the water table dropped over the years, the cost of water in terms of deep bore drilling and pumping equipment escalated. Thus, a 2009 UNDP report notes that in some areas of Yemen, a number of powerful landholding individuals have been able to capture the bulk of available resources that have been directed towards investment in modern drilling and pumping equipment, controlling the benefits of these investments and directing them towards their own personal enrichment. Yemeni sociologists with whom we work speak of a growing consolidation of water ownership and thereupon of land ownership in the hands of rural leaders who, through political position and wealth in land, were able to invest in the requisite equipment. Although the illusion of removing natural constraints forever was short-lived, scarcity-driven relations to the environment would be broken up everywhere in Yemen. In spite of a considerable increase in the volume of water extracted, access to groundwater remains spatially restricted to aquifers in highland basins and in the coastal lowlands. Pressure on the water resource kept growing in the past decades as regions experienced the consequences of technological investment in irrigated agriculture made by a minority, leading successive waves of rural migrants to try their luck as laborers in agriculture or to congregate in the sprawling suburbs of cities. In rain-fed regions, water harvesting structures were not maintained, leading to waste of water and diminution of overall water availability. In essence, today, Yemen remains a water and land-scarce country. But dealing with climatic uncertainty and ecological variability has always been a challenge for Yemenis. Yet changes of such a magnitude have occurred since 1970, and here I'm quoting my agronomists, that the degraded situation of natural resources in all agro-ecosystems of the country is certainly the greatest challenge to be faced today when planning future food policies and agricultural strategies. How much more time do I have, Rami? Are you watching me?
Yeah, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, so I will race along. I'm sure I have 10, but anyway. So besides the drops in the water table and the concentration of control over water extraction through deep bore drilling, The effects of terrorist, this is what is less talked about, the effects of terraced destruction, that is the loss of that half of rain-fed agriculture in large part, on erosion and runoff recharge below terrace units are now extremely visible. And it is now generally admitted that erosion problems have increased in the last 40 years to become a major national problem. At issue is soil erosion in the upper catchments associated with changes in forms of production, and the domino effect of aggregated flash floods that has caused the destruction of economically viable terraces downstream and of wadi bottom land. In some places, the phenomenon has reached such proportions that a major part of formerly productive spate-irrigated lands bordering wadi channels has disappeared. Thus, the collapse of the upland terraces threatens the entire watershed system, provoking ecological devastation downstream and reducing groundwater recharge, especially in the major coastal wadis. Okay, I've got 5 minutes to speak to
3, 2,
policy.
Do you want 5? Okay.
I want 5.
Go ahead.
Okay.
This is interesting.
With regard to the international foreign, the international development policy that underpinned the kind of changes I'm describing. As I said, essentially there was a division of labor between the aid world and the Yemeni government, so that expenditure and investment on agriculture by the Yemeni government itself remained under 3% of the government budget, and most of that, and still remains, devoted to irrigated agriculture, not rain-fed agriculture. Essentially, the thrust from the late 1970s and early 1980s of the development projects in those years was to increase investment in irrigated agriculture with a view to export agriculture to Saudi Arabia in the first instance. So if from the late 70s in all the major irrigated wadis of the lowlands in Tahama, irrigation works were financed that strengthened the hand of the upstream landlords and put them in a privileged position in the growing market for irrigated fruit. And the European Union still considered these wonderful fellows to be, who had private jails in the late 70s, by the way, to be considered today entrepreneurs. There was no policy with regard to land tenure, and that of course contrasts greatly with what went on into South Yemen, where there was major land reform that was rolled back, and more than rolled back, after reunification in 1990, as were also the programs of the South concerning women's marital rights and family planning programs. And very little attempt from the international development world to control the expansion of bore wells, and it has continued to focus on projects that increase the market-oriented crops of households. It is true that from the early 2000s and with the Social Fund for Development, because the situation has become so critical, and today we have very close to real famine in Yemen, that there was a certain shift to increase the capacity of poor families to produce food and some basic infrastructural types of community-led, even from the World Bank after 2005. But overall, in the face of major environmental degradation and growing inequality to land and water, such projects remain marginal in the face of very positive, marginal in overall government and international economic strategy for Yemen. And this remains true even in the face of very positive results from smaller projects that have tackled terrorist rehabilitation in a sector of a village. If you want in the discussion, I can tell you what IFPRI in its donors conference of 2012 has as its priorities, but fundamentally nothing has changed there. It is true what has changed is some of the Yemeni youth activists, and I'm honored to have one of them in the room today, that have opened a debate on the role of the aid industry in relieving Yemen's government of responsibilities, in guiding its economic policies, and in patronizing elites ill-placed to challenge fundamental inequality and political militarization. But at least for right now, in the face of younger Yemenis' attempts to reclaim political decision-making, the international solution has entailed, once again, increased militarization and and even more direct US, UN, Saudi management. I want to close, because it may sound like, God, there's absolutely nothing to do. But you can ask me, as I said, essentially the doctrine coming from the international agencies hasn't shifted fundamentally. In the IFPRI document of 2012, investment in agriculture is still justified in terms of export earnings, which is kind of, a great, and we need to, public-private partnerships. Well, I was describing the public-private partnership that controls the import of 56% of food. We want to strengthen that. So, what country are they talking about? But anyway, okay. So, and indeed, the list of IFPRI, which if you want me to, which is symptomatic and it's very close to what the EU says, it in fact covers a whole host of things, bases of sort of demands of what should be being done, that make one wonder what government there was that had not done half of what they are now calling for. And indeed, if the government was so deficient, what is not being said in these policy documents? And so I'll just close with what is not being said in those policy documents. What is not said is that the very basis of food production needs rebuilding and conservation, that such rebuilding can be done by local groups with government support, that women's rights to land can be built into such initiatives, that women form the backbone of small farming families. They're not some sort of gender additive to somewhere else. That small farming families are the guardians of biodiversity, that knowledge of cultivation and water harvesting methods and of seed and animal types can be strengthened, both through local transmission and through the introduction of scientific biobanks and research. I'm in no sense hostile to research, but you have to look at the structure of the research. And there is nothing about conservation and development of native types of animals and a whole host of the plants in Yemen. And that a successful family planning program, because these fellows, of course, say, oh, let's just import, the Iranian family planning program as though you sort of pick it off a tree, requires both universal health coverage and less reactionary ideologies in the name of religion, and that its uptake requires an economic minimum of coverage of basic needs. That real estate construction, unlike what it is in the IFPRI document, is not productive industry. That let us look around Beirut, right? That it is classified as industry, real estate construction. That it is possible to regulate a market so as to permit cot sales on only certain days, as was done in South Yemen successfully in the past. That inequality and the concentration of wealth are not God-given derivatives of the market or property itself. Yemen always had essentially private property, unlike Bilad Sham. But it did not have this level of concentration of property ownership. That inequality and the concentration of wealth are not God-given derivatives of the market or property itself, but the result of public policy over many years. That such policy can be changed to restructure property rights. That government expenditure on the military and security, as with petrol subsidies, which is what they're squawking on about being changed, and it has in part been changed, can be redirected to basic production, and that Yemenis need to take back their own government to such ends. Yemen has done no service by outsiders such as myself observing the kind of language rules that are amply observable in the policy documents that I've skipped over, that actually exclude such statements as I've just made. Thanks a lot.